Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning, friends. So, we are going to take up another important issue which is related to unit 2 of the discussion on rural society, that is theorizing peasantry. I think within theorizing peasantry, as we have seen that we had spoken about the issues relating to debating peasantry. We have also discussed about the agrarian capitalistic development and the theory of peasant economy, and here we are dealing with the unit 7th, that is economic aspect of peasantry. Economic aspect of peasantry is going to be a unit which will talk about the peasantry on the lines of economy. Although we have spoken about the issue of economy earlier also, but this unit is specifically dealing with the economic aspect of the peasantry. And here I think our major concern is that we will try to speak about the works of Karl Marx regarding the peasantry as a class, and also we are going to speak about the contribution of Daniel Thorner, who had also spoken about the economic history of peasantry in the various facets. See, basically when we try to speak about the economic aspect of peasantry, we try to speak about many important components, and I think before this we had discussed that how people like V. I. Lenin, Kotatsky for that sake, or maybe we try to speak about the contribution of Daniel Thorner, and also we have Chenov's contribution with regard to the theory of peasant economic behavior. So, I think we had many ways in which we can represent or we can speak about the economic class of peasantry, but here I think the concern is that how we can locate or we can have the economic referent of the peasantry, and for that sake, as I shared earlier also, that we are going to speak about the contribution of Karl Marx and Daniel Thorner. And both these works are being reflected in Chenin's book, that is on the peasant and peasant society, which I have referred earlier also, and this is basically taken from the original work. So, I think most of the things are bit sensitive and also very exhaustive account of how we can locate the peasantry with regard to the economic criteria. I think that is where we have tried to see the things. So, we will divide this discussions into two broader halves. First segment will be basically devoted towards the understanding of peasantry, and peasantry which has to be seen in a what you can say pattern which has been spoken about by Karl Marx, and second component we will be speaking about the contribution of Daniel Thorner. So, I think both the works will give us a detailed account of how both the scholars have tried to see peasantry in terms of an economic category, and how we can see the economic aspect of peasantry within that particular framework. So, I think to begin with, we will first try to focus upon Karl Marx. As we all know that Karl Marx is basically famous for his contribution in the field of the analysis of class. He had spoken about class and class struggle, and that is one of his famous theory which has been read by economist, political scientist, sociologist for their sake, anthropologist, and many other social scientists. And Karl Marx understanding of class is based on the economic criteria, and that way I think when we try to speak about Karl Marx understanding of class, we will try to see that to what extent the peasantry tries to qualify the understanding of class in the Marxian framework. And I think this story of Marx in lines of class is bit different, because it will try to focus upon various aspects, and somewhere we will try to see that how peasantry are being not clearly taken up by Marx in his own analysis, and he was trying to see it with regard to a specific episode which took place long back in Europe, and then he is trying to see that how the French peasantry, basically his concentration or his understanding was based on the French peasantry, and he was basically trying to look into the French peasant, and within that framework he was trying to speak about this particular contribution. So, Karl Marx and his basic work is Peasantry as a Class, and Karl Marx, he was basically speaking about this work from his discussion that has been taken from Karl Marx, The Class Struggles in France in 1848 to 1850. That is one important contribution, and also the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. That was another important contribution which has been taken into consideration in dealing with this work, that is Peasantry as a Class. And I think these things are reflected in Karl Marx and Friedrich Engel's selected works, which is a popular work in 1950s. So, basically we will try to see that this has been taken into consideration from these important works of Karl Marx. So, to begin with, how peasantry was being seen as a class, we have to see that how Marx tries to locate peasantry, basically the French peasantry, in the domain of class. That is going to be an important issue. So, I think let us start with that. First thing, we have to have some background about that how the French peasantry was being seen, basically with regard to the changeover which was taking place in France. And I think as we all know that Napoleon Bonaparte, who was basically seen as the real hero of the French society, and how he was trying to put peasantry in particular domain. So, I think we have to have this story which will basically be revolving around the French society, and also it will give a wider picture about how the peasantry can be seen as a class. So, it is basically the starting point comes with the 10th December 1848. It was the day of the peasant insurrection. Now, why this day has been seen as peasant insurrection? Because we try to see that it was the day when the peasantry start showing the revolutionary character, and only from this day does the February of the French peasant dates. So, I think that is going to be an important issue, the symbol that express their entry into the revolutionary movement. So, I think we have to see that how peasantry was being seen as a class, and basically they were being seen in representing the revolutionary character, and that is going to be an important issue. And as I said that Napoleon was the only man who has exhaustively represented the interest or and the imagination of the peasant class that was newly created in 1789. So, Napoleon in 1789 was trying to speak about the consideration of how peasantry wants to see their world, and in that way Napoleon was to the peasants not a person, but a program. With the banner, with the beat of drum and the blare of trumpet, they marched to the polling booth, shouting that no more taxes, down with the rich, down with the republic, long live the emperor. Behind the emperor was the hidden, the peasants' war. So, I think this is the narration which speaks about that how the peasantry, they were trying to be during the voting time, they were trying to support the Napoleon Bonaparte's effort for making him the emperor, and they were basically trying to support him like anything, because for them he was the real hero who could just bring the glory of the peasantry. So, 10th December was coup d'état of the peasant, which means overthrowing the existing government. So, 10th December, that way 10th December 1848 becomes a crucial issue. Bonaparte represents a class, and the most numerous class of French society at that time was the small holding peasant. So, that is going to be an important issue, because peasantry was an important class which was being represented, and the other dynasties apart from Napoleon, who were basically trying to have a certain control over the dynasty, were the Bourbons, who were the dynasty of the big landed property, and the Orleans were the dynasty of the money. So, Bonaparte are the dynasty of the peasants, that is the mass of the French people. So, I think the whole house, the whole French society was been divided into these three dynasties: Bourbon, Orleans, and the Bonaparte dynasty. And Bonaparte was basically representing the peasantry, whereas the Bourbons and Orleans, they were representing the dynasty of the elites. Further, Marx has said that the small holding peasants forms a vast mass, the members of which live in the similar condition, but without entering into the manifold relations with one another. I think this is the definition of Karl Marx for understanding peasantry as a class, and I think once we are trying to move further, we can be in a better position to know that how peasantry has been represented in terms of a class. He said that their mode of production isolates them from one another instead of bringing them into the mutual intercourse. I think that is going to be an important issue, that their own mode of production, that is the agriculture on land, that was basically isolating them from one another. The isolation is increased by the France's bad means of communication and by the poverty of the peasants. So, I think in addition to the so called mode of production, the other important issue was the bad means of communication which has been there, whereby the interaction between the peasantry was not taking place, and also the poverty of peasantry was another important issue. Their field of production, the small holding, admits of the no division of labor in its cultivation, no application of science, and therefore no diversity of development. That is what is been reflected by Marx in terms of analyzing peasantry, that it did not have the critical division of labor, which is the representation of the true class, and also they had the small holdings, and apart from that there was lesser use of science and technology in terms of agriculture, and also they did not have a vision of development. So, under these considerations, no variety of talents, no wealth of social relationships were the important things. Each individual peasant family is almost self sufficient. It itself directly produces the major part of its consumption, and thus acquires its means of life more through the exchange with the nature than in intercourse with the society. So, I think the interaction is normally being seen with the nature, and lesser interaction is seen among the people, among the peasantry themselves, and we try to see that peasantry is seen basically as a small holding peasantry, a peasant and his family, alongside them another small holding, a peasant and his family, another peasant and another family, a few scores of these make up a village. So, the different categories of the peasant family, the scores of that is the dozens of that, they make up the village, and few scores of village make up the department. Department is the specific township, specific city life. So, the few scores of village make up the department, that is to be seen in terms of the typical district. In this way, the great mass of the French nation is formed by the simple addition of the homologous magnitude, much as the potatoes in the sack form a sack of potatoes. I think that is the common term which has been used by Karl Marx with regard to referring to the peasantry, that they were basically seen as homologous magnitudes, much as the potatoes in a sack form a sack of potatoes. In so far as millions of families live under the economic conditions of existence that separate their mode of life, their interest and their culture from those of the other classes, and put them in the holistic hostile opposition to the later. So, I think the relationship between the peasantry and the wider society was not very ripe, it was not very fruitful, rather there is having certain amount of hostile opposition between the two categories, and this is how they form a class. So, their understanding about the formation of a class has to be seen in terms of how their economic condition of existence separate their mode of life from the other classes, and that is how we can represent the peasantry in terms of a class. They cannot represent themselves. Now, this is what the peasantry is. They cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. Their representativeness must at the same time appear as their masters wanted, as an authority over them, as an unlimited governmental power that protects them against the other classes and sends them rain and sunshine from above. So, virtually the leadership of the peasantry is missing by themselves, and what is required is that they wanted to see their leadership through somebody else, and who is going to give the color to their what you can say terms and conditions towards their requirements. The political influence of the small holding peasants therefore find its final expression in the executive power subordinating the society to itself. So, we see what Marx has said about the peasantry is that they are basically into the subordinate position with regard to somebody who is going to rule over them, and that is where the peasantry was being seen. So, the historical traditions gave rise to the belief of the French peasants in the miracle that a man named Napoleon would bring all the glory back to them. So, this is where the hope of the French peasantry has been there towards Napoleon, that how he is going to bring about certain amount of what you can say glory to the peasantry, and that is where we try to see that the understanding of the peasantry, the trust of the peasantry was on Napoleon. So, they could not represent themselves, but their representation was being seen coming through Napoleon, and that becomes an important issue. So, in the rising after the coup d'etat, that is the war against the dynasty, a part of the French peasants protested arms in hands against their own vote of 10th December 1848. That is the day when the French peasant have to overthrow the existing dynasty, and they have to have the rule of themselves through the Napoleon. The economic development of the small holding property has radically changed. The relations of the peasant to the other classes of society has changed. Under the Napoleon, the fragmentation of the land in the countryside supplemented the free competition and the beginning of the big industry in the towns. So, I think under the Napoleon regime, the peasantry had these changes. The peasant class was the ubiquitous protest against the landed aristocracy, which had just been overthrown. But in the course of the 19th century, the feudal lords were replaced by the urban usurers. The feudal obligations that went with the land was replaced by the mortgage. Aristocratic landed property was replaced by bourgeois capital. The small holding of the peasant is now only the pretext that allows the capitalist to draw profits, interest and rent from the soil, while leaving it to the tillers of the soil himself to see how he can extract his wages. So, virtually we try to see that the small holding of the peasant is the way in which there is the capitalistic attempts to draw the profits are there, and it is basically from the interest and the rent from the soil which is going to be the only way in which the profit can be earned. So, virtually we try to see that this is basically seen as an important issue. Besides the mortgage with the capital imposes on it, the small holding is burdened by the taxes, are the source of life for the bureaucracy, the army, the priest and the court, in short for the whole apparatus of the executive power. So, virtually the taxes which has been generated from the peasantry was been used by the so called executive power for their own benefits, for their own luxuries, and that way I think it was taxing for basically the peasantry. And finally, it produces an unemployed surplus population for which there is no place either on the lands or in the towns, and which accordingly reaches out for the state office as sort of respectable alms and provokes the creation of the state post. So, I think the situation of peasantry in the regime of the authority in the against the state power was seen to be very subjugated, and we try to see that this particular thing was seen because of peasantry's situation, and we try to speak about these particular things, and we say that the French nations from the weight of traditions and to work out in the pure form the opposite between the state power and the society. With the progressive undermining of the small holding property, the state structure erected upon it collapse. The centralization of the state that the modern society requires arises only in the ruins of the military, bureaucratic, governmental machinery which was forged in opposition to the feudalism. So, I think that is where we try to see that feudalism was been replaced by the so called government machinery, but this government machinery also had a specific pattern of ruling, and which was basically making the things more worse, and we try to see that this is how the condition of peasantry was being seen. Napoleon, who was basically been seen as the hero of the peasantry, and he was basically trying to overcome the circumstances which has been laid down by the peasantry, and the peasantry which was been seen as sufferer in terms of paying heavy taxes to the government machinery. So, I think peasantry was not having certain amount of collectivization, as Karl Marx has spoken about this particular issue, that peasantry were just seen as the sack of potatoes who were not coming together in the form of collectivity, because their mode of production isolates their interaction. So, I think these are certain things which makes the things more disturbed, and that is where we have to see that ultimately it is the concern for the peasantry to show how they can be represented in the wider world, and we try to see that the French society which has the majority of the peasantry. Now, this peasantry which were in majority has been seen as been exploited by the minority in terms of the ruling class, and the different dynasties which has been there, the dynasties of the rich, the Orleans, the dynasties of the so called feudalistic order. So, I think these sort of dynasties were trying to succumb to the pressures, or they try to just overthrow the peasantry's existence and to have more and more exploitation of the peasantry. And Napoleon was basically been seen as a hope which could bring the glory of the peasantry back into the surface. So, this is how we try to see that Karl Marx was trying to see that how the peasantry has to be represented, and we also try to see that peasantry which was basically seen as what you can say representing the majority of the French population in terms of the countryside, but on the contrary we try to see that the dynasties were basically trying to exploit and Karl Marx, who was not clearly speaking about the sort of class consciousness within the peasantry, which is an essential characteristics of peasantry of class according to Karl Marx. So, he was not trying to speak about. So, we try to see that the peasantry was seen as having certain element of class in itself in terms of people who are falling in the similar mode of production. So, to that extent I think they form a class, but when it comes down to another important issue of certain amount of revolution, that is class for itself. So, that class consciousness was missing with regard to the peasantry, and ultimately we try to see that class for itself character which was not visible with the peasantry, and they wanted to show that visibility through somebody else, and this somebody else was basically the Napoleon for the case over here, which has been highlighted by Karl Marx. He was basically trying to speak about that how the peasantry was being seen as representing the true character of the people, of the masses in general of the French society. So, I think this is one segment which tries to speak about the peasantry as a class in terms of an economic category, which was the topic of our discussion. And as I said that the second half will be devoted to another important contribution by Daniel Thorner, and Daniel Thorner that way I think is again going to represent the economic history, and the famous work of course is peasant economy as a category in the economic history. That is the work, and this is also been taken from Theodore Shannon's contribution, that is Peasant and Peasant Society. So, virtually we try to see that both the works, Karl Marx Understanding about Peasantry as a Class and Daniel Thorner's Peasant Economy and Category in the Economic History, they have been well documented in the contribution of Theodore Shannon on peasant and peasant societies. And since as I said that these are the original works, so we have to have the understanding more in terms of what exactly has been reflected in the work, and that is where we have to see the whole understanding. So, coming down to Daniel Thorner, as the title itself speaks about, that peasant economy as a category in the economic history, that how peasant economy has been reflected in the economic history of the world, which has been talked about by Daniel Thorner. And for that purpose, it is essential to define peasant economy as a system of production and to distinguish it from the other historical system such as slavery, capitalism and socialism. So, I think that is the first important thing that we have to take into consideration. Then also we have to have a tentative definition of peasant economy, and then to illustrate by the different examples across the world. So, this is what has been talked about as an important assignment which has been taken up by Daniel Thorner. And here Daniel Thorner was dealing with the features of the whole economy of the sizable countries, and the countries which he was trying to speak about, he has basically taken into consideration the units which act as the scale of kingdoms or empires. Basically he was referring to Japan, Tsarist Russia, China, and then he was trying to speak about the nation like Mexico and the grand imperial possession including India and Indonesia. So, virtually he was trying to speak about the various units in terms of empires which I shared, in terms of nations, and also in terms of the imperial possessions. So, I think these are the three broader units from which he takes certain countries and tries to give a justification for the peasant economy in these countries. Now, Daniel Thorner has also given 5 criteria for determining whether the total economy of a given country, nation or the large colonial area is to be taken as a peasant economy. So, I think this is where I think the 5 criteria has to be taken into consideration. The first 2 criteria relates to the production and the working population. They are intended to help distinguish peasant economies from the industrialized economies, whether capitalistic or the socialistic. In a peasant economy, roughly half of the total population must be agricultural and more than half of the working population must be engaged in agriculture, and this is how we try to see that the economy of the nation has to be identified. In a word, we are saying that to be termed peasant, an economy must be primarily agricultural. I think that is going to be an important issue that we have to take into consideration, and in a capitalistic or the socialistic society which has been industrialized, there may remain thousands or even millions of peasants, but we would no longer apply the term peasant to such an economy taken as a whole. We have the distinction which has been there between the place which with the region which we say is a peasant in the typical sense. The criteria definitely which will be followed is the production and the working population, that is going to be an important issue as we have said in the first and the second criteria. The third criteria requires the existence of state power and the ruling hierarchy of a particular kind, one in which the kinship or the clan order has weakened sufficiently to give way to the territorial state. So, I think this is the third criteria which we have to take into consideration, that where the state power has come into existence and the kinship bonds and the other issues are going to be secondary. We can have the fourth criteria which comes into the picture, that is the rural urban separation. I think the four criteria which speaks about that how the rural is going to be in relation with the urban settings, and here we try to see that for the peasant economies, the presence of towns and the division or break between the towns and the countryside is simultaneously there, and we have the political, economic, social and the cultural elements which are going with the peasantry. In practice, the peasants are held to be lesser or subject order existing to be exploited by all concerned, means peasantry are going to be dominated by the urban in that sense. That is the basic criteria which has been used. And then we have the fifth and the final criteria. The fifth criteria is the most fundamental, that is the unit of production. The unit of production, by that we mean our concept of peasant economy, the typical and the most representative unit of production are the peasant family household. We define the peasant economy, peasant family household as a socio-economic unit which grows crop primarily by the physical efforts of the members of the family. So, this is how the peasant has been defined, that we define peasant, that is Thorner defines peasant family household as a socio-economic unit which grows crop primarily by the physical effort of the members of the family. The principal activity of the peasant household is the cultivation of their own land or the allotment. The household may also engage in other activities, for example, in handicrafts. The family may work, perhaps be forced to work outside the household from time to time. The household may include one or more slaves, domestic servants or hired hands, but the total contribution of these non-family members to the actual crop production will be much less than that of the family members. So, I think in terms of proportion, if you try to see, so we try to see that proportionately the peasantry in terms of economy in the unit of production, they have to contribute more, even if the helping hands are there, that may be there, but that is not going to affect the character of peasantry. So, in a peasant economy, half or more of all the crops will be produced by the peasant household, relying mainly on their own family labor. So, the effort of the family labor is going to be important. Alongside of the peasant producers, there may exist the larger units, the landlords or the home farm tilled by the labor extract from the peasants, the estates on which the peasants may be employed for part of the year, the capitalist farm in which the bulk of the work is done by the free hired labor. So, I think these things may also exist parallelly, but it is not going to influence upon the peasant economy. So, I think these are the criteria which are being taken up by Daniel Thorner. In a peasant economy, the first concern of the production unit is to grow food crops to feed themselves, but this cannot be their sole concern. By definition, they live in a state and are linked with the urban areas. They must sustain the state, the towns, the local lords. Hence, in one way or another, they must hand over, surrender or sell to other parts of their food crops. So, I think that speaks about the linkage of peasantry with the wider world, and we should try to see that it should not be seen as a slip into the trap of imagining a pure type of peasant household. Peasant household which is typical isolated, which consumes practically everything it produces and practically nothing else, as distinct from the impure type which produces for the market as well as for its own immediate needs. So, the latter is historically more common and more characteristics. In point of fact, the household unit in the peasant economies frequently dramatize their dual focus by growing two crops. The first is the cereal, essential to their own subsistence and that of society as a whole, and the second is much more likely to be the non-food grain. It may be a fruit, a fiber or an oil seed which is produced precisely with an eye to barter, sale or exchange of some sort to the marketplace or to the urban setting. So, we try to say that the subsistence as well as their relationship with the wider world, both the things have to happen simultaneously, and that is how we can see that the market oriented and substance oriented crops are to be grown by the peasantry. To be brief, we have defined peasant economies in terms of the predominance of agriculture both in working population. We have required the existence of territorial state. We have indicated the characteristics unit of production which must be seen in terms of the peasant family household with a double orientation, that is for themselves and for others. And also we have to see that we must emphasize that no single one of these elements will suffice to determine whether or not a given economy is indeed a peasant economy. So, somewhere we try to see that all these features must be found together and must relate to the economy of a whole country, and that is where we have to see that these 5 criteria which has been identified by Daniel Thorner are important for understanding the peasant economy with regard to what you can say the world economy. And we have to see that if all these 5 criteria are been fulfilled, then only we can say that this category can be represented as the peasant economy vis-a-vis the nation state. Now, as we have shared earlier that Daniel Thorner has given the example of Tsarist Russia, Indonesia, Mexico, India, Japan and China. So, let us deal one by one with these categories. We try to see firstly he was trying to take into consideration the Tsarist Russia. We all know that in the peasant economies of Tsarist Russia of the 19th century, they have the richest history, and the Russian scholars carried the analysis of the peasant economies further than anybody else. So, that way I think peasantry are being duly represented in the Russian literature. In the century and half before 1917, the imperial structure of Tsarist Russia was expanding out into Siberia, and that is where we try to see in terms of the peasant economy, the most distinctive feature of the countryside is in the later Tsarist era was the close interdependence of landlord, estate, land and rights and small peasant holdings together. In centuries before the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, the bondage of peasantry guaranteed the landlord the labor supply needed for their estates. So, I think there is a relationship which is there between the peasantry and the estate, that the peasant household were basically acting as the providers for the labor supply to the estate people in that sense as such, and we try to see that the size and the importance of the old landlord estate was much reduced through time. By the late 19th century, individual peasant tenures were gradually increasing its importance, and this has happened basically after the various changes which took place across the world, especially the world war situations. In the decade after the revolution of 1917, Russia ceased to be a peasant economy, emerging instead under socialism as both urbanized and industrialized. So, virtually we try to see the Russia which was having a long history in terms of the peasantry, especially in the estate system which has been there under the Tsar's rule, but with the advent of the modernity, the significance of the growth of capitalism in the city and the country, we try to see that Russia has ceased to have the peasant economy in terms of the 5 criteria which has been referred earlier, and we try to see that Russia cannot be depicted as a nation which can represent the peasant economy according to Daniel Thorner. The second country which he is speaking about is Indonesia. Indonesia under the Dutch rule constituted one of the oldest and the most striking colonial rule in both of its major forms, direct or indirect. And we try to see the peasants were compelled under the so called cultural system to grow certain crops which the Dutch wanted to export. This is basically a condition in which we try to see that they were basically involved in development of the large plantation for the growth of export crops, for which for their labor supply for these plantations the Dutch drew on the peasants from the bordering villages. They emerged particularly in the Java and the Sumatra, a pattern of large plantation, the village communities with the group rights in lands and small peasants among them, among whom in the course of time the sentiment of the individual family holding deepened. So, I think this is where we try to see the change has taken place. The missing element within the Indonesia was the indigenous capitalism, which is a colonial in a colonial setting was practically negligible both in the city and in the countryside. As of 1949, when the Dutch had stopped the control, Indonesia has very little modern industry and a quite limited urban population, barely enough in fact to qualify under our criteria as a peasant economy. So, we try to see that even Indonesia does not represent the characteristics of peasant economy as per the criteria of what Daniel Thorner was speaking about. And then we have next the case of Mexico. Mexico, it is basically having the similarities between the peasant economies of Java and Mexico, which is quite visible. And in Mexico, during the century after the end of the Spanish rule in 1823, there was a pattern of large estates which were locally called as the haciendas, the unfree labor supply which is called as the peonage in the local setting, and also the weakening village community rights in the lands and a very slow growth of individual family holdings. I think these are the characteristics which has been there basically with regard to the Mexican situation, and we try to find out that in Mexico if we try to see the industry has expanded rapidly in certain parts of the country, and it is because of the large part of substantial foreign investment which took place, and hundreds of thousands of peasants have left their villages to find work in the rapidly growing cities because of the fast urbanization. And in the decades, recent decades, well more than half of the national product has been the non-agricultural, and now the half of the country's population is urban. So, Mexico has left her phase of peasant economy according to Daniel Thorner, and it also does not represent the true character of the peasant economy as per the criteria which has been raised by Daniel Thorner. And then he was trying to speak about the contribution which has been reflected in terms of peasantry in India. And regarding India, he was trying to speak about that India, which was basically everywhere was the peasantry, peasant families, and they were basically the cultivators of the small amount of lands. Caste and untouchabilities are the distinctive characteristics of India, and one of the principal economic function of caste is the countryside has been to emphasize the inferiority of the lower caste who have for ages served their superiors as the cheap dependent agricultural labor. During the the regime of the British development in India, half dozens of the largest railway systems in the world has been introduced, and along with this appeared many other elements of what the economics jargon called as the infrastructure of development. Since India attained independence in 1947, the government has thrown its weight behind the rapid development of the comprehensive range of heavy industries. In the 1950s, the agriculture principally carried out on by the small peasant families still accounted for the roughly half of the total national product. India is today still a peasant economy. So, I think if you try to see in the Daniel Thorner's understanding, India is marked by the typical peasant economy according to Daniel Thorner. Talking about another important nation, that is Japan. Here with regard to Japan, Daniel Thorner says that less than 50 years after the Meiji restoration of 1868, Japan has ceased to be the peasant economy. And we try to see that vast literature assessing the abrupt and dramatic revolutions which took place in Japan, and we try to find out that after the Meiji restoration of 1868, the peasant proprietors were freed from their feudal obligations and confirmed in the ownership of the land they cultivated, and because of these reforms the old rice levies were supplemented by the fixed annual tax in money payable to the state. And we try to see that this situation was advantage for the rich peasants who sometimes acted as the rich brokers, and that is how we try to see that there was certain amount of progression which has happened with regard to the understanding of the peasantry in Japan. The average for tenants, the Meiji reforms brought no benefits. They still had to pay rents in kinds, and at the rate of about half of an average crop, the rise in the price of rice did not help them since they marked so little. So, in the early 1880s, about 1/3 of the arable land was worked under the tenancy. By the time of the First World War, the fraction has increased to nearly 1/2. So, we try to see that the average area worked by Japanese peasants was about 1 hectare around 1868 and remained for the most household roughly in the same right up to 1918. So, we try to see that this is the story of Japan, where we have the Meiji restoration reforms have took place. We try to see that the proportion of the population living in the villages usually defined for Japan as place not less than significant population of 87%. In terms of our first criteria of peasant economy, contribution of agriculture to total national production, Japan by the eve of the First World War had unmistakably stopped being a peasant economy. So, we try to see that even Japan did not reflect the element of the peasantry which has been talked about by Daniel Thorner. And then we try to speak about another important nation, that is trying to speak about China. And as in India and Japan, The agriculture of China for several centuries before 1950 has been seen as a petty culture, and we try to see that in China the peasant handicrafts which has been traditionally offered supplementary employment weakened before the competition of machine made goods from Japan and the West. The development of modern cities was very limited and entirely inadequate for draining off the population from the countryside, and we try to see that the China was having paying the heavy rents on their tiny holdings in terms of tax collection, and the Chinese peasants were tenants or petty owners cum tenants, and the amount of rent they used to pay, that was very heavy. So, the difficulties of the peasantries were compounded by multiple extractions from landlords, warlords, usurers and petty government officials. They suffered further in the course of wars, invasions, famines, civil war and the revolution. So, in the years since 1950, the Peking regime has exerted the tremendous effort to transform this peasant economy. In the cities, there has been the immense development of modern industries. In the countryside, the vast program of land reforms begin by taking away the properties of the landlords and redistributing the lands in the small bits to the peasants. So, these attempts have been made. Apart from that, the village cooperatives, collective farmings and the establishment of the large rural communes had also taken place. Whether the agriculture contribution half or more of the total national product has been there or not, I think that is going to be an important question, and it is hard to say with any assurance whether or not China is still a peasantry economy. So, I think somewhere we try to see that transformations which took place in the countryside and also in the urban areas, the things which had taken place by the Peking regime in 1950s, certain modifications have been there with regard to China, but still we try to see that whether the peasant economy can be retained in China or not, that is going to be an important question. So, from these 6 examples which has been taken by Daniel Thorner of the peasant economy, which has been drawn from the modern world, we have been explicitly seeing the various criterias, and we have to see that to what extent in all these nations we try to see that the 5 criterias which had been identified by Daniel Thorner has to be seen, and we try to find out that he was trying to see things on these lines. First thing of course is the indigenous or the colonial rule that which he tried to see across all the nations. Then the small scale cultivators only which has to be given more importance or prominence, that is another important issue. We also have to see the individual family holdings of land only, that is going to be another important issue. Then also we have to speak about the hierarchy of peasantry at the village level, that is another important issue which one has to really see. And finally, we have to speak about the urbanization and industrialization as a factor in reducing the relative importance of the peasantry in the economy taken as a whole. So, I think these are the things which has been focused upon by Daniel Thorner. We might say that we have sketched the cases of countries in this particular framework, and we try to see that how the peasant economy has to be seen under these parameters across the world, and how we can represent the peasantry economy. So, it may be of interest to situate peasant economy as we have defined as Daniel Thorner has defined in relation to Karl Marx well known mode of production. Our peasant economies includes societies falling under the Marx feudal mode of production and his Asiatic societies. So, I think somewhere peasantry can be located in these 2 categories in the Marxian framework. We also have to see that the time has arrived to treat European experience in categories derived from the world history. So, I think we should not see the European model as the universal model which is going to be appealing for everybody. Rather, we have to see that to what extent we may be in a better position to squeeze the world history into the Western European countries. We have to see that the European experience in category derived from the world history, and it should not be that the world history has to be shrinked into the Western European categories. I think this is where we have to actually see that somewhere we have to locate that how the peasantry has to be visualized and how the peasantry can be seen as an important categories in terms of the economic history. And as we said earlier that Daniel Thorner has extensively seen the various countries, and based on the 5 criteria which he identified, either it has to be seen in terms of the question of what one can say, speaking about the basic issue of production and the working population, and also on the criteria of state power and the ruling hierarchy, and also the criteria of the rural urban separation, that is going to be important, and finally the issue with regard to the unit of production. I think on these broader parameters which Daniel Thorner tried to speak about, he was trying to justify that how the peasant economy as a category in the economic history can be located. So, I think this is where we have to actually see that how the things have to be worked on, but important is that either we have spoken about in the first section about Karl Marx, how peasantry was been seen with regard to the French Revolution, especially the advent of Napoleon Bonaparte, and how peasantry tried to contribute effectively towards the maintenance of the new dynasty. That is going to be an important issue. So, what is required in that sense is that they have to basically see things differently. So, peasantry as a typical class in the true Marxian sense cannot be located in the explanation which has been given by Karl Marx with regard to the peasantry, and they are to be seen as a sack of potatoes which has been emphasized by Karl Marx. On the issue of Daniel Thorner's understanding in terms of a typical economy, we try to see that the economic aspect of the peasantry which has been talked by Daniel Thorner, especially how he is trying to link up the various issues. We try to find out that Daniel Thorner on the basis of his classification could find that only in few places like in India he could locate that peasantry is going to be visible, and to some extent it was been visible basically in Japan, but more or less if you try to see that peasantry in the true sense has to be seen on various parameters, and that is going to be an important issue when we try to speak about the contribution of both the scholars. I think we have talked in detail about the economic history of the peasantry, how in the economic framework we can locate the peasantry in terms of the economic history, or in terms of how peasantry can be seen on an economic parameter. That is the discussion that we had in this particular outline of discussion that we had, but important is that how much or to what extent we are going to make ourselves conversant with these works, so that we can have a real picture about the understanding of peasantry in terms of the economic reference. So, friends, I think the further discussions will make the things more clear. I think we have talked in detail about the economic history of the peasantry, how the